Thanks for inviting me to speak on money in Proverbs. It's a nifty little book, Proverbs, and it's got some good things to say. So we're just going to get into some of it. Don't have time to go into everything it has to say. So I've titled this talk with a question mark: healthy, wealthy, and wise. And I guess the underlying question here, what does that even mean in terms of the book of what the Proverbs has to say around the questions of health and wealth and wisdom, which is its central topic? So we're looking at issues of money and wealth and what Proverbs can say to us usefully on that subject. So let me just say a couple of things about the book of Proverbs itself to get us going. So it's part of what's generally referred to as the wisdom literature of the Bible. So the books of Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes, the three books that really, in one way or another, grapple with the subject of wisdom. But Proverbs is very different from Job's and Ecclesiastes, which are much more deeply questioning and angst-ridden books, whereas Proverbs is really, I think, as Adam has called it, a book of life hacks, of statements. And they often seem quite settled statements about how to live well, although they're perhaps not as simple as they seem on the surface, as we'll get to in a moment. One thing that is helpful to understand about Proverbs is not something that you'll find stated in the book anywhere, but really the underlying idea that makes the whole thing, allows you to understand what the book of Proverbs is getting at, and its underlying theology, if you like. And I've described that as a theology of a providentially ordered creation. So that's a fancy way of saying that God has so structured creation or so structured reality in such a way to allow for the thriving of life. And if we live in accordance with the structure of reality, then life thrives. But when we live in denial of the structure of reality, then bad things happen, and that ultimately leads to destruction. Or to put that in more modern language, might say that there's an ecology to life. God has created things such that there is an ecology to life, so things work together in certain ways to ensure the thriving of life. But you can only ignore that ecology or go against it for so long before there's some sort of kickback within the system. And that's really the sort of underlying idea behind the book of Proverbs that helps us understand it. The other essential part of that, it's all about wisdom, and the central contention is obviously that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, that you cannot really understand anything well. You can't understand the nature of reality. You can't understand the order of creation or begin to understand it rightly until you know who God is and what God is like, what the character of God is, if you like. That's central to the whole thing. So if you don't have that ingredient, then you're going to go astray. It doesn't matter what sort of life hacks or aphorisms you come up with. If you don't have that as a guiding thought, then you're going to misconstrue it somehow. The other thing we need to pay attention to is with Proverbs, perhaps more than most books, but this is true of the whole Bible, is not to take any one part of it as a full statement of truth. In fact, the Proverbs, the way they come to us is these short, very limited statements. They often seem disconnected from one another, the little aphorisms or life hacks, as we've called them. And we might say that each of them is often a limited statement of the truth. And when you read through the book of Proverbs, at a superficial level, it looks like it's full of apparent contradictions, that it seems to say one thing, then later on seems to say something like the opposite thing. But we can see that in our own world of contemporary Proverbs, the idea that actually the very nature of Proverbs is they only ever grasp a limited truth. So we have Proverbs like, many hands make light work. And that describes a truth. That's something real. That's an important truth to remember when you're slogging away at something hard, that sometimes it can make things a lot better to get other people involved. But we have another proverb that too many cooks spoil the broth. That's also true. We've all probably had plenty of experiences where there's just been too many people involved in some activity, and it's really getting in the way of the work being done. So both these things seem contradictory, but actually they're describing a bigger truth that requires wisdom to discern what the bigger truth is around when we need more help and when it's best to have fewer people involved in things. So that's the approach we need to bring to the book of Proverbs, to read each statement of wisdom in relation to the whole. And so when I say that, I mean in relation to the whole of the book of Proverbs, what all the other sorts of proverbs it has and statements of wisdom, but actually also in relation to the whole of the Bible, and for Christians in particular in relation to the New Testament as well. So for us, that goes to the idea of our knowledge of God, our fear of God, and the character of God. We have to relate that to our knowledge of who God is revealed to us in Jesus. So that becomes an important part of how we read Proverbs as well. So if you don't do that, if you just take one statement and you place too much weight on it, then you can end up in some dangerous places. But if you have those caveats and you read it in relation to the whole, there are some real gems in the book of Proverbs. So let's have a look at what it has to say on the subject of wealth. And I'll start with the subject of both wealth and poverty, because I think it gives a good example of the complexity and diversity of statements that you can find in Proverbs. The first statement I have here is from chapter 8, where this is wisdom speaking in her own words. And she says, I walk in the way of righteousness, along the paths of justice, endowing with wealth those who love me and filling their treasuries. And that seems to suggest at face value that if you're wise and just, you'll be wealthy, and that wealth is a good thing. That seems okay. That seems an interesting thing for it to say. But then you find another proverb like this in chapter 11. Riches do not profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. So that puts a little bit more of a critical slant on wealth, that it's, well, it's not going to help you in at really critical times, the day of wrath, but righteousness will. Then you might have another proverb like this. Those who trust in their riches will wither, but the righteous will flourish like green leaves. This is perhaps an even more critical positioning of wealth, that this idea that wealth is something that tends to become something that we end up trusting in, and that's dangerous. And it poses a question about whether there's some sort of tension between riches and righteousness. So that question is raised for us. Well, what about poverty? What's it say on poverty? Well, you can find a proverb like this, and it says, a slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes them rich. So that's an idea we're familiar with, that people are poor because they're lazy, and people who work hard end up getting rich. A very simple view of cause and effect in the world, which a lot of people still hold to. So you can find that in the book of Proverbs. But then you'll also find a statement like this. The field of the poor may yield much food, but it is swept away through injustice. So in this proverb, we see that actually the field that the poor work in can bring them plenty, but they don't have plenty because others are involved in stripping it away from them. There's systems of injustice at work, and that's what makes people poor. And we might find a proverb like this too. Better the poor walking in integrity than one perverse of speech who is a fool. So in this proverb, we have a picture of a poor person who is righteous, who is in the right in the proverb. in their poverty. And here the poor person has integrity over and against someone else. So that's a different thought again. So you can see that once you start to read Proverbs, you get a complexity of ideas, and we're forced to start to think and engage between them all. We could spend a lot of time doing that, but I want to try and to make this cut to the chase of this talk. Find, I guess, the balance of the book of Proverbs, where we find the balance of wealth and money. So I had to include this proverb because it's my favorite, because it's just so true. Like a dog that returns to its vomit is a fool who returns to his folly. And certainly I've had that truth brought home to me plenty of times in my life. And I don't just mean when my dog goes and checks out its own vomit, which it does. Yeah, so that's a good proverb on its own, isn't it? But it's pertinent to our subject because the subject of wealth and possessions is an area in which humans have demonstrated enormous folly. And again, we could probably just look at our own lives and see that truth. But certainly once you started to look at the bigger picture of humanity, both just what's happening now in the world and human history, then that lesson is just written large for us in huge letters. So what does wisdom look like in relation to wealth and possessions? Well, I think there are two little gems of Proverbs that really actually sum up the balance, if you like, of the book of Proverbs, but also of the Bible actually in relation to this. This is the first. My child, eat honey, for it is good, and the drippings of the honeycomb are sweet to your taste. So this is a story, a proverb about honey, but clearly it's not really just interested in honey. It's about much more than that. This is about really material stuff. And at the heart of this proverb is the idea that the good things of creation are there for our enjoyment, and they are good. Honey is good. It is sweet to the taste, and you should enjoy it. It's there for you to enjoy. And this is a really important part of the biblical witness about creation and material things. So the resonance of those incredible statements in Genesis chapter 1, the sevenfold statements about the goodness of creation, just continue to redound through all material things to the created matter of the universe. It is good. It is really good, and it is there for us to enjoy. And so this little proverb captures what is a strong theme, particularly in the Old Testament, but we find it in places in the New Testament as well, where there is a real celebration of good food, comfortable homes, and beautiful things. These things are celebrated in and of themselves, for the enjoyment that they bring as good in and of themselves. But, and there's a big but, next chapter we find this little proverb. If you have found honey, eat only enough for you, or else having too much, you will vomit it. So we're back to the vomit, which is obviously an important image, biblical image for us. So here we have a development of that thought. And again, once again, this is a thought that is entirely consistent with what the Bible has to say as a whole about material possessions, material life, which is that the good things of creation are good for us only within certain limits. Beyond that, they're no longer a good thing. There is such a thing as too much of a good thing, if you like. There is such a thing in the Bible as too much, and that's the idea. We have stated explicitly here, too much. Now, between these two ideas, this is the core idea we find actually in the foundational story of biblical economics, which is the story of the manna in the wilderness that we find in Deuteronomy. And there, if you remember, in the book of Deuteronomy, it's the story of the new economy, if you like, that the Israelites are given after they are liberated from slavery in Egypt. They're saved from their oppression and brought out of Egypt. And there in the wilderness, they're given a new economy. And the whole point, the structure of this economy is such that none will have too little. And we all understand that concept, that's no one wants to have too little. We get that well, but it's also that none will have too much. So that's an interesting statement. Just an interesting little connection. That Deuteronomy tells us that the manna was sweet to the taste, a bit like honey, actually. So there might be stronger connections between the stories than we necessarily immediately apparent. Certainly the ideas are entirely consistent. So in the manna story, we have this idea of making sure that none have too little and none have too much, because too much is bad for everyone and bad for the earth. And actually the rest of the economic instructions that are given in the 5 books of the law, the Torah, and there are a lot of economic instructions, and they're basically what fill out the economic vision of the promised land, if you like. You can sum them all up by essentially saying they're all commandments to live within limits, to observe limits in the conduct of our material and economic lives. And that's how we preserve goodness in our material and economic lives. So that's a pretty radical idea, actually, for people like us, that there's such a thing as too much. Well, if you don't believe me, here's a graph from the Living Planet report, which when this sort of graph first came out, they were very controversial. These days, not controversial at all. It's now basically not universally accepted, but very widely accepted as representing the position that we are in at a planetary level and at the level of the human race. And so what this graph is describing is what's called Earth Overshoot. The idea that the amount that humans collectively consume of the Earth's resources annually each year is now more than the planet can sustain, more than it can replenish and renew, and that we crossed that line sometime in the mid-1980s. And since that time, we've been continually increasing our levels of consumption. Not quite sure where that looks like in these last 2 years of COVID, but the general trend is pretty clear. So that's a pretty sobering and scary idea that humanity is now living in what, if you like, the ecological credit of the planet. We're spending credit, and at some point, the planet can only afford so much credit before there's a credit crunch, that there will be some sort of kickback, and we're increasingly starting to see that in relation to climate change and other things. Whoops, excuse me. I'll just get rid of that. Should have put the phone out of the room before we did this.
You're fine, mate. I can cut that out. Just give us 2 seconds of pause before you start talking again, okay?
So that is a scary thought, but here's the kicker, really, is that 80% of the human race actually consume within sustainable limits, beneath what the earth can sustain. So less than our budget, if you like. It's the top 20%, the top wealthiest 20% of humanity who are doing all the overconsumption, who are taking us over that line. And that's us, folks. We are the top 20% wealthiest people of humanity. Probably most of us on this Zoom call are within the top 10%, actually. So when we look at the too much of what humanity is taking from the planet, that's us. And we can see that this is not an abstract concept at all. It's real, and it is a pressing issue. Okay, I won't push that any further. What does the book of Proverbs have to say to us that's helpful? What does that mean for us as people of faith? Well, here's two more Proverbs which I think help steer us in the right direction. And from chapter 16, better is a little with righteousness than large income with injustice. So we hear it's a very simple statement that there's something, it says better, and we could do well to really fill that out with the fullness of what better means, the goodness, that it's much better to live with less than we currently have, but live in right relationship with our neighbours, both near and far, and live in right relationship with creation itself. And that the benefits of this are far greater than just having a personally larger income. So it's a very simple but very profound thought that you can do a lot with. And what we see here in this little proverb is really something that's pointing us forward to what is really, I guess, one of these central New Testament ideas around our economic life and material possessions, which is the idea of contentment. So we find that idea present in Jesus's teachings on the Sermon on the Mount, particularly in chapter 6 and 7, and in Paul's various statements in his letters to the churches. The idea that it's possible and that we should be able to be thankful, not just content, but thankful for what we have, whether that be little or whether that be much. And where we have much, so thankful that we're able to give it with overflowing thankfulness to those who have less. This idea of being able to be content with a little and not thinking about what we don't have. That's rooted in a deep and profound thankfulness. So that's one important statement. The other statement is this one from chapter 30, and this really sort of is getting towards the close of the book of Proverbs, and it's sort of a bit like a summing up of a lot of its themes. Give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. And when we hear that term daily bread, we should hear a few things. We should immediately hear that's the central part of the, if you like, the economic part of the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray, the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. And when Jesus was praying that, he was invoking the story of the manna of the wilderness directly. I think we need to understand that. And that so when we're praying, give us this day our daily bread, we are praying that none shall have too little and that none shall have too much. We're actually praying that. So we're drawing on these deep themes of the Bible. And then this other statement, or I shall be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? And that's an interesting statement for us to think about as the people for whom globally we represent the rich. The idea that's being posed here, that actually riches, the suggestion that perhaps they become a blockage in our relationship to God, or they can be. And it raises the interesting question for us about whether the deep spiritual poverty that we see in our own country and our own culture, whether that's directly connected to our affluence. Now, that's an interesting thing to ponder, I think. But certainly we see again this strong affirmation of the idea of enough, not too little and not too much. So where does that leave us? So I guess in conclusion, to sum all this up, if we just recount the things that the book of Proverbs tells us, I think pretty clearly, is that we're called to definitely a deep love and appreciation of the material world. We're not being called to this otherworldly disconnection from material life. Some people think Christianity is all about just rejecting the world and rejecting material things and saying we have no concern or love for them. That's not the biblical attitude. It's actually truly valuing and truly appreciating them. And that it's because of that deeper valuing and appreciation that we are able to be content with less of them. So our appreciation of the material world is one that is ordered by our knowledge of God, which we talked about. So it's our knowledge of the character of who God is, and particularly the character of who God is in Christ for us. And with that, our yearning and our love of right relationship, of shalom, of this picture of the right relationship between God, humanity, and creationship. And that is something of more value to us than lots of honey, as it were. So for people like us in affluent Australia, I think the practical implication of all of this is that the challenge for us, people who live in a glutted culture of overconsumption, is that we need to find ways to become content with less somehow. And we need to be people who can find greater, not less value in material things, but actually greater value in material things, such that we can be content with less and begin to understand the true value of the good things that God has given us. And I think I'll finish there. Thank you.